Good morning. Good morning. Once again, this is Paul Friedman and Safer Country. I'm the executive director of Safer Country, the gun violence prevention nonprofit focused on keeping guns out of unsafe hands. And we're pleased to have with us once again for Chapter 5, the wonderful Andy Goddard, legislative director of the Virginia Center for Public Safety. And we're pleased to have any guests come on and chat with us, send questions through the chat room during our session. And we'll be here for an hour, as usual, every Friday to talk about what's happening in the Virginia legislature with regard to newest gun laws that are moving through, as well as broader topics. So today we're going to take a few minutes to start with what's been going on in the world, because it really does relate directly to what we've been doing here in Virginia. And I think we can't avoid discussing really what happened yesterday in the House of Representatives when Marjorie Taylor Greene was stripped of her committee assignments due to, among other things, the direct violent threats that she made in various campaign ads and on social media towards fellow members of Congress. And as well, the video that we saw of her harassing David Hobb, a teenage survivor of the Parkland shooting. And I want to point out that not only is that was her stripping of those committee assignments appropriate, it was the minimum that we should have seen done, but of course the maximum we can expect to see. What's special about Safer Country and in context with the Parkland story is that we were actually incorporated in Virginia on February 14th, in the year after the Parkland tragedy. So we feel very close to that tragedy. We feel very close as well in that we are fighting to raise awareness about the need to fully implement Virginia's new red flag law, also known as a substantial risk protection order, and to see that expand beyond Virginia. It's now in 19 states in the District of Columbia. It should be in every state. And of course, we'd like to see it applied to Marjorie Taylor Greene, as Fred Gutenberg has been saying on TV nationally. If she were living in Florida, where this law exists, they would certainly be investigating her based upon her history and considering removing any weapons she might have. And she is probably living in DC while serving in Congress, or perhaps in Virginia or Maryland nearby. All three jurisdictions have this law, and it would be excellent to see this law applied to her fairly and legally. So let me turn to Andy at this point. I want to thank Andy once again for devoting an hour every week to talking about what's happening in Richmond. But before we get into that, Andy, please, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what happened yesterday. Go ahead, lay it on us.
Yeah, it was interesting to see it happen. It was interesting to see also that she was not, didn't appear in any way to be apologetic. But it's very important that all of us push back at every opportunity on the idea that armed insurrection, that the government is there to be overthrown by the people, should a certain group of them feel aggrieved in some way or decide that something that the government has done is tyrannical. We don't have that in our Constitution. It is not there at all. In fact, it's prescribed in there as being something which we cannot do. So there's not only support for it, it's very clear that it's not acceptable. And I'll remind everybody that the reason we have a written constitution is because people were trying to overthrow the government by force of arms, and a lot of people who'd sat down and studied what was going on were very concerned that the Articles of Confederation in place at the time were not strong enough to stop these insurrections. So that was the genesis of our Constitution, was to stop insurrections and other things, of course. So the idea that somehow it's now supported by the Constitution is beyond nonsense.
Well, Andy, I think I'd love to have your thoughts on this subject, because I do think that the NRA And what happened in the development of the lying that the NRA did to the public about the meaning of the Second Amendment and the entitlement that its membership should have to guns has led directly to the kind of expansive lying we've now seen grow into, what happened with Trump's success in becoming, as a candidate and becoming president, and even now continuing to lie about whether he still is president, and which I think, still believes he is. But the NRA, they were lying for years about the meaning of the Second Amendment, and about the threat of every Democrat coming to take all of their guns at every turn, and many deeper and more upsetting lies than those. How do you feel about that?
Well, I agree. I mean, we've been lied to as a country for many, many years by different groups. NRA has been particularly good at messaging subversively against good, reasonable legislation. They have lied outright, and they have exaggerated, and they have taken the position that they will create a fearful situation in order to be able to prop up gun sales. If gun sales start to flag, we need a new boogeyman. We need something else to be afraid of, that we will force people to go out there and say, well, I don't really want to get one of these things, but look at the situation. It's so bad that people are dying in the streets, so I have to have a gun. And it's been a very powerful, but it's been incredibly subversive lies and exaggerations. We were lied to by the cigarette industry that it was quite okay. In fact, it was cool to smoke. It didn't do you any harm. It made you a better person, or put you in a better mood, all this kind of stuff. We saw through that. It's about time we saw through the lies from the NRA too.
Absolutely, and perhaps we can also directly connect the NRA to the rise of these gangs. They call themselves militia, but they're really just gangs, as we've discussed in past episodes, of people who are desperate to find some reason to use the weapons that they've been encouraged to buy, and out of a sense of fear that their government might become tyrannical and attack them and take their guns. And as a result, they spent a lot of time gathering together and training. And now we've seen what they were training for. Now, unfortunately, too many of them have virulent views on other matters, whether it's misogyny or racism and white supremacism, anti-Semitism. There's a whole range of beliefs that these people have. And when you combine that with weapons, we've seen now on January 6th just how dangerous that is, and it's heartwarming. It's heartwarming to see some of the members of Congress speak about their experiences and how personal, their experiences have been, and how powerful it's been for them. But it's also encouraging, I should say, to see that the new administration is going to be approaching this issue with a determination to protect us.
Yeah, we've got to push back on the notion that all this kind of marching around in fake uniforms and carrying weapons that would be almost as useful in Fallujah as as the ones that we give to our military, other than the automatic fire button, which a lot of military don't use anyway because it just wastes ammunition. That this is something that is needed, and it's something that you need to have to be a civilian in this country. You don't need to be a mock military person to be able to survive in this country. You shouldn't need to, and I don't think you do need to.
Well, we've seen the gun sales reports, and we know that the AR-15s and their like are much more popular than many of the other possible weapons they could be selling. So they need to create a reason for people to buy those weapons, because there just aren't enough people interested in going out and target shooting with those things. They need to actually motivate people out of fear to get them. And now they're expanding them into trying to get people to hunt and use them. And so let's take that into our a chance for us to transition over to what's happening in Richmond. Let's just talk about where that law is right now, that proposed law to allow hunters to use AR-15s and the like, and then we'll move on to other laws.
Yeah, that bill was heard in committee. I thought it was going to die because it hadn't been assigned to a subcommittee, but it was finally heard yesterday in full committee. And the patron himself started the discussion by saying that there was a huge amount of controversy in the hunting world as to whether these small caliber but high velocity weapons should be used for hunting large game. And there is you go on any hunting board and you will find a discussion about whether it's sporting, whether it's ethical to use this kind of weapon. And a lot of people are on the other side saying, yes, they're just as powerful. They kill people. They should be able to kill deer. But there are many states which have rules which say you can't have more than 3 bullets in your gun when you're going hunting. But if you use one of these weapons, you can have, other than the bolt action ones, which are, single shot or the minimal amount of ammunition, the regular AR-15, you can stick a 30-round magazine. Heck, you could even stick a 100-round drum in there if you wanted, and go out and just spray and pray. And that's really not hunting. So, the idea at the end was that the bill would be passed by indefinitely. And then a letter would be sent to the game department asking for their opinion. It was a bit of a punt, really. I think they realized that they couldn't get the bill passed this year, so they're punting it to the game department to say whether they believe that an AR-15 or its ilk is suitable for hunting game. So
what do you expect the response
will be back.
What do you expect that response will be?
I don't know. I would imagine that there's probably as much a discord in that group as there is in the general hunting population as to whether it's sporting or not. If it was football, I'd throw a fag on it for unsportsmanlike conduct.
Well, I'm sure the animals would feel appreciative of you throwing the flag.
I think if you're going to kill a deer, you should be pretty sure that you're going to kill it, not just wound it.
Yeah.
It's humane to kill it, in a humane fashion. It's not. We don't want a lot of deer running around in the woods with holes in them that didn't, that affect their health, but don't kill them.
And in addition, as we've talked about before, people shooting those weapons, they're going to miss those deer occasionally, and probably more than occasionally if they have to hunt with this approach. And there are people occasionally going to be behind those deer, maybe out of sight.
Well, the misnomer here, the misunderstanding is that the very small caliber weapons, as .223, have very short range. Well, that's not actually true, because the bullet travels so fast. It comes out of the muzzle of the gun so fast, 3 times the speed of sound is quite possible for these things, that they will travel an enormous distance before they start to drop and finally hit the ground. So, the idea that, yes, it is a small bullet, but it's going at an incredible rate. And the velocity of a bullet is squared when you look at its impact power. So you're talking about doubling something, you quadruple the impact if you double the speed. So with these bullets are fired at an enormous speed. But there is also, by using just the caliber of the bullet, that describes only the diameter of it. What it doesn't talk about is the weight of charge put behind this thing. If you have a very small charge behind a small diameter bullet, then it won't be very useful to kill deer. But most of these bullets have a very powerful charge, which sends the bullet out at an enormous velocity.
All right, so we've spoken about the related law that was suggesting that they might open up Sundays for hunting. Has that been quashed?
That died. Yes, that died. That was good. There was one other hunting bill, which was to redefine the term muzzle loader, because apparently the gun industry has manufactured a new type of weapon which still needs the bullet to be pushed in through the muzzle, but you put the powder charge and the primer into the breech of the gun. Now, that's very interesting. In fact, the powder is put in sort of in a cartridge form, which is very good in the sense that it keeps the powder dry. You don't have to have a flask and pour the powder down the muzzle of the gun. So it makes it easier to load and easier to unload. However, one of the things they forgot in the bill is that muzzle loading weapons are exempt from background check under the category antique firearms. And under the definition of antique firearms, it has to have been made before 1896 or something, or it has to be a replica of a gun that was made in those times that could not fire regular ammunition, or it has to be a muzzle loader. Well, if it's a muzzle and breech loader, it could be potentially modified, because the breech plug is removable on some of them, to handle modern ammunition. So if you want to put in a bill to redefine something in the code, you have to go to all the sections where that definition is used and make sure that you haven't run into any conflicts. And unfortunately with this one, the way I would read it, unless they redo the bill, then we need to redefine this type of weapon under the exemption from background checks. Otherwise, this kind of muzzle and breech loader should be subject to background check.
And what do you think the prospects for that are, and for that bill to succeed? And if it is something we're concerned about, what number bill is it?
I'm not that concerned about it in a sense of from a gun violence point of view, but just from a technical, we don't like, nobody likes to create in the code something which is ambiguous. And if you're changing a definition in the code, you've really got to go through and find all of the occurrences and make sure there's not something in there. So it's a technical issue. It's kind of wonky. It appeals tremendously to me, not so much to the legislators. And I think that there's not many people down there who are worried about going into the details of this. We're trying to get the information to people, but right now it's sailing through. We'll try and get it sorted out in the Senate. The simple answer, of course, would be to just specify that this new kind of weapon, because it's difficult to call something antique when it was made this week and it was using a technology which was not available in there, and a design which was not available in an antique. Antique exemptions are fine by me. I don't care. I don't care about muzzleloader exemptions. But if you're going to change the definition of muzzleloader, you have to have a way to exempt it from being background checked.
All right. Let's take a moment and step back and talk about crossover, because this is a critical time in the process. You talked about fixing a law in the Senate. Well, we're going to see some laws jump from the House to the Senate and from the Senate to the House. Why is, maybe you can talk about this and with me, why do we see crossover now? And you want to talk a bit about how this whole session was structured, and what does crossover mean to us in particular with the laws we're looking at?
Well, always any particular piece of legislation has to be read by both houses and discussed by both houses. And in the past, it's a very useful check on having two sets of eyes look at something and come up with things that the other side may have missed. It also gives it a chance for lobbyists to get their toe back in again and try and get something changed that they wouldn't listen to on the other side. But I just quickly mentioned that of the 28 bills that are referenced for our concern this year, 12 of them are the ones which we support. All 12 of those are going to cross over into the other house. Of the bills we opposed this year, there were, I think it was 7 of them. All of them have died. So they will not be opposing anything per se on the other side, other than trying to make technical changes. A number of bills.
That's very reassuring. That's very reassuring.
A number of bills that we were watching. We always have keep a close eye on certain bills that we have no position in the sense that they won't possibly have a positive or negative effect on gun violence, but They are vehicles which could be tinkered with to change their meaning. And we've been very careful in the past, because on a number of occasions, bills have been put into, say, the Senate, which were apparently very, very good bills. In fact, have engendered us to say that we support those bills. And then when the bill crosses over to the other house, to the House in that case, the patron has actually changed the language significantly to make it something which the Senate never even saw. And that's happened a few times. And that's why we have these bills called watch bills, because it's quite possible for a patron to introduce a bill into the other house which has not been read by the first one. And that's a tricky thing, but people are up to a few tricks here and there.
Right.
The rules of the Senate and the House apply up until the point that they don't want them to apply.
Now we're having to go into a special session in order to extend this session, because the Republicans refused to grant the normal length of time for this year's session. Can you explain all that?
It's been normal that the short session should be 30 days, but it's always been extended at the beginning of the session, because 30 days is really a very short period of time to get through both houses with a bill. It gives you only a couple of weeks before you have to go through every bill. If they would cut down the number of bills, then it would probably be okay. But they didn't this year. The Republicans decided that one of the things they could do was to throw their oar in and say, no, we're not going to allow the extension. So now we've been acting as though the session was going to end in 30 working days. So the date was set for the crossover. Now we understand that the deadline is extended. The crossover is still today. So, I don't know what they're going to do to fill the time in the extension. I think they'll probably find that if they keep going at the rate they've been going, we won't need the extension.
Now, is that partly because we did trim the number of bills, of my understanding at the beginning, due to the pandemic? Is that the case, or is that not the case?
Yeah, I think one of the trimmings was also because of the extended special session that took place last year. They spent a lot of time. That was dragged out over a really long time. Again, technology was a problem, getting people because of COVID, getting people together, getting people to be able to do things online. But I think after a rocky start, we've got that kind of worked out now. And I think with occasional hiccups, but the online testimony and hearing of the bills is working reasonably well now.
So let me ask you this: you've now experienced lobbying and advocating on these bills for many years. How many years now in Richmond have you been doing this?
This is my 14th session.
14, and this is maybe the first one where they've gotten the system down on the Zoom approach. And which do you prefer?
In person.
And why is that?
Well, because what you can't do by doing things like this is I can't go to somebody's office and sit down with them and go through the details of a bill. Technically, I suppose you could call them up and do it by phone, but what we've done on a number of occasions is to get several people together and have a discussion of a bill and give our points to the chairman and other members of a committee prior to the meeting of the committee, because on the day, they're not going to sit there and listen to you for 15 minutes. You have a very short period of time, sometimes only seconds, to get your point across. And if there's a technical bill which has got lots of moving parts to it, you can't possibly do that. You can only hit a couple of, maybe at the best, a couple of high points in your verbal testimony. So it's not just the fact of being there in the committee meeting. It's the ability to go from office to office in between time and talk to the LAs and get their opinion, find out whether a particular legislator is going to vote in a certain way, and is there any possibility that they could be persuaded? Have they really looked into this? Are they interested in it? All those kind of things. That's missing, and we haven't come up with an electronic way of filling that in yet.
And also the public at large we used to come in on for legislative days, and people would come in for particular issues or identity groups, and they would want to come in and speak to legislators and make a case for their issues of high priority. That's been restricted
Oh,
considerably.
very much so, yes, because they can still, I mean, the public is still able to sign up and get to speak in the committees, but it's that office time. It's the time when, late in the evening or early in the morning, when you can catch somebody in their office and sit down with them and say, do you have any questions about this legislation? Because we have special interests, so I can go through 28 bills. Last year I went through 141 bills and found out a position and the technicalities on the bills. They're not going to do that because they're facing 2,000 bills. Even their LAs are not going to have enough time to go through every bill with a fine-tooth comb. So I think there's a great value to having special interest people not just push their point, but actually get the details out so that the people know what they're voting on. I mean, there have been some horrendous situations in the past where someone has stepped up and said, especially after this crossover, when the bill didn't originate in that particular body, have stood up in a meeting when on the floor and said, this is a bill to do so and so. There was a classic example when someone stood up and said that they were representing this bill for the House and in the Senate, and this is a bill to talk about how unwanted cars are disposed of. Well, that was fascinating, but it wasn't about unwanted cars. It was about unwanted guns, and it was the disposal of guns that were purchased in a gun buyback program. And people were sitting there. If they hadn't read anything, they voted very handily for what you do with a disposable car. But that's not actually what was being in the bill. It was guns, not cars. And me sitting at home screaming at the TV didn't seem to get that across to them.
Well, look, in 2020, Democrats made incredible advances with regards to laws on background checks, limiting handguns once again to once a month, one purchase per month, reporting lost or stolen firearms, child care facilities designated as family day homes must lock any firearm in a safe or cabinet during hours of operation. The penalty for recklessly leaving a loaded firearm around children under the age of 14 was increased. Trigger activators designed to make semi-automatic firearms shoot more than one shot with the pull of the trigger were banned. Gun safes were made that cost over $1,500 or under $1,500 were made exempt from retail sales tax, and people who were served with permanent protective orders had to surrender their guns within 24 hours. We made some incredible advances in 2020. Now, looking at the laws that you see moving forward right now that you think are going to be successful at this point, give us a list of what you see as the real achievements we're going to be seeing coming out of this session.
Well, unfortunately, one of the bills, which I think would be the most useful in terms of reducing gun violence, is the move to copy the federal law into state code for people who have been convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence against a family member. Currently, the federal law says that those people are not allowed to possess firearms. But like with any federal law, if you don't have a state analog to that, then the state police cannot implement that without a special permission from the government. The government hasn't got the facility to come to Virginia to follow up on these things. So we need that. Now, the argument against it is that, well, that's only a misdemeanor. Well, it's a misdemeanor under federal law. And that's, they decide that beating up your family member is a misdemeanor and not a felony. So it's still a prohibition under federal law. If it's prohibited federally, it should be prohibited in the state code so that our own police can actually do something rather than waiting to go around to pick up the dead bodies afterwards. The second one that's going through fairly well so far is the codification of Governor McAuliffe's ban on firearms in Commonwealth-owned or leased buildings, which this year will extend to the Capitol grounds and the streets and sidewalks that border the Capitol grounds. That is a very important bill. One of the things about that is it will reduce the number of people who decide to go to the Capitol carrying heavy weapons, dressed in uniforms, and intimidating people who are trying to be there peaceably to petition for redress of grievances, which is what the Constitution calls for. It's this way, the groups that are going there and intimidating and preventing us from doing our peaceful work by intimidation. Those will be kept away from that area, and it's a blow for the concept of, if you can't win with the ballot box, then you can win with a bullet box.
Yes. Well, you called it Terry McAuliffe's bill. It's a bill that's put forward in the Senate by Adam Evan and in the House by Mark.
Yeah, but Terry McAuliffe put in a executive order. Currently, the guns are not allowed in those buildings by his executive order, and so this now codifies that into Virginia code, and now it becomes law as opposed to simply an executive order. Excellent. And I think it's great to extend it to the Capitol grounds, because we've all seen in the last 2 years enormous numbers of people trying to get onto those, or succeeding in getting onto those grounds, and standing there and parading and marching and doing all sorts of quasi-military things with very heavy weaponry, which is technically completely unconstitutional and unlawful, but they've gotten away with it. So now we won't have to worry about whether they are going to be prosecuted for it, because they won't be there.
Well, that's interesting. How about enforcement? Because we talked earlier in our series about Richmond and its ordinance with regard to guns on the streets in particular circumstances, and they were reluctant to enforce at a full level for fear of the reaction. How do you feel? How will this be enforced, do you feel, and will it be more effective?
Well, obviously, entry into the Capitol grounds from outside will be subject to going through gateways. And on days when they believe that people want to go there in large numbers carrying guns, on a day-to-day basis, I don't think there'll be much enforcement unless Capitol Police are walking around the grounds and they see someone, with an enormous rifle thrown over their shoulder, just meandering through the park, in which case they probably go over and tell them, hey, you realize you're not supposed to be in here with that. But on the days when they're going to be there and plan to be there to protest and are planning to be there in numbers and have a permit to have X number of people, then it will be quite easy to say to the permit holder, okay, but nobody comes in here armed.
Excellent. I look forward to seeing how that works out, and I hope that it will be done, and the people who are seeking the permits will abide by that, because we are in an age when we can't really trust that is going to be the case.
Well, the sad thing about it is if a large number of people wearing uniforms and carrying military-style weapons are breaking the law, then you have to have an equally armed or more heavily armed group to enforce that law on them, because a couple of policemen are seeing 10, 12 guys with assault rifles. They're not going to risk their life trying to say, hey, you realize you're breaking the law, we're going to arrest you now, So it's becoming some sort of an arms race within the public square, and that's not got to be, there's not got to be allowed to continue.
Yeah. Well, we saw that on January 6th at the Capitol, when the Capitol Police were overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And they had to retreat. They had to find ways to avoid being harmed. And of course, a number of them were harmed. One was killed on the scene. I believe now we have a report that one lost some fingers on his hand. Others were injured in serious ways. And of course, we know that there were 2 suicides in the department in the days immediately after. So, we do have a crisis here, and we can't avoid that reality. And we know that there are people determined to press their point, organizations that are devoted to this. And we may have to see a show of support from law enforcement on the streets to deter that sort of action in the future. And hopefully, though, we can't avoid that.
Well, I think it's up to everyone to not accept the concept that a person walking around, a private civilian citizen walking around in a quasi military uniform, carrying quasi military weaponry, helmet and bulletproof vest, is doing so peaceably. The fact that they don't fire the gun at somebody isn't the definition of peace in my book. The definition of peace is the lack of the possibility for violence and the lack of intimidation. Most of those people, if they are following the law, those guns would be unloaded anyway. And some people bring their guns unloaded. Well, if they're bringing them unloaded and wearing a bulletproof vest, what is your intention? Is it to just intimidate because of your appearance? And if it is, intimidation is part of violence.
Absolutely.
It engenders fear.
Yeah.
And that's not acceptable.
Correct. So let's get to a few other laws because we have a limited amount of time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, another good one is currently, if a background check throws up some question as to whether the person is or isn't allowed to purchase a gun, the authorities, in this case the Virginia State Police in Virginia, who do the background check, they have a 3-day period in which to find the information needed to decide yes or no on your purchase. Well, 3 days is fine as long as they're not trying to find something from a court in another state and getting information back from that court as to how the adjudication was handled and things like that. So 3 days is a pretty short time. Now, this only applies to a very, very small number of instances where someone may be mistaken identity because they have the same name and come from the same town as somebody who is definitely prohibited. They may have a problem with the same name and even birth date as someone else. But there's a bill in there to allow that 3 days to go to 5. The reason it's dangerous is because technically, if the Virginia State Police has not told the seller within the 3-day period that the person is allowed to buy the gun, then after 3 days have passed, it's called default proceed, and the seller can then lawfully continue with the sale, even though they haven't heard the response back from the Virginia State Police. And this happens in a tiny, I can't emphasize enough, there's only a very small number of people are inconvenienced by this. But Dylan Roof, the guy who shot up the church, Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, he had gone through this process, and they were taking time because they picked the wrong court to ask about charges that had been filed against him in a court. And it wasn't until much later that they found out that he was prohibited from the purchase. But by then, unfortunately, he'd already used the gun. So I don't like the idea of a default proceed. I think that many gun sellers actually decide amongst themselves to say, if I don't get a positive answer back, you don't get the gun. And that's the default halt. And I think that makes much more sense. And I think a lot of gun sellers are very good about that, but they're not all that good, and so you've just got to find a gun seller who's prepared to wait the couple of days and then say, well, I didn't hear anything. So yeah, here you go, take it.
What can we do to effectively improve the coverage of those stores to see how they're operating? We're going to have to, I'm going to let you talk for a moment, and I'm going to go on mute because
Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about the background check system. Most cases, the background check is almost instantaneous. I've actually sat in and listened to the background checks coming in by telephone, and by the time it gets to the point where the seller is calling and spelling the name of the person out, having said the name and spelling out the address, the person at the other end in the Virginia State Police or the NICS system has typed in that name and typed in that address pretty much because of what they heard. They're just confirming with the spelling, and they will actually interrupt the person who's telling it and say, "Yep, they're okay. They go ahead," or they will say, "No, definitely not. Do not sell the weapon." Now, of course, they never tell you the seller what the problem is. If there's a problem, they don't give any information out to say, no, he can't get it because he has a mental health adjudication or things like that. But with the Virginia State Police, when they deny a purchase, they actually, if it's a purchase that's taking place at a gun store, they actually dispatch an officer immediately to the gun store. And in many cases, they'll catch the person coming out of the store or still in the store who has basically must have lied on their form. And in many cases, they will be able to prosecute that person for lying on the form. But they have, of course, on occasions come across people who really honestly didn't know that they were prohibited, in which case they get let off with a caution and being told that, hey, don't try this again. But we prosecute about 750, I think it is, roughly that number of people each year who've lied on the form and tried to buy knowing that they were prohibited, which is why we wanted to get the background check extended to private sales, because if you couldn't buy from a dealer, you could always go to a private seller before and bypass that background check.
Now, there's been talk for a number of years about the fact that while most gun dealers are attempting to do their job well, there are usually a handful of locations that are known for guns that seem to have ended up in criminal activities, and they all seem to emanate from those stores. How are we watching that in our state and what are we doing about those stores when we find a problem?
The problem here is that guns that end up being used in crime, the ATF is required to trace each one of those guns. Any gun that appears in a crime scene has to be traced back to its original purchaser. So the gun lobby has successfully prevented the ATF from computerizing any of their data. So when a serial number is presented by the ATF, they have to go through shipping containers of paper to try and find out when the gun was sold, who it was sold to. And of course, that will only take you to the initial purchaser. After that, the trail goes completely dead. What happens here in Virginia is pretty much the same thing. But at one time,
let me stop you right there, if I may, yeah. Andy. Is that a federal law that they passed to prevent us from doing that?
Yes, it is actually. Yes, it was called the Tiert Amendment. It's an amendment to a budgetary bill, I believe, and it prevents the ATF from sharing information on gun sellers. And the thing people need to know about gun sellers is when we did be able to trace where guns were initially sold, if you think about it, if criminals end up with guns that were sold in dealers' stores, which of course at one time most of them were, then you would expect the more guns that were sold by a dealer, the more likelihood there would be guns that ended up being used in crime. But it isn't that way. You would expect the biggest dealers to have a large number and the smallest dealers to have a small number. In fact, 80% of dealers have virtually no guns traced back to them from crime. And 1 or 2% have an enormous number. So there are 1 or 2% of my numbers, I could be a bit more accurate. I can't remember off the top of my head, but definitely a tiny number of gun dealers are responsible for an enormous number of guns that are traced from crime, which means that they're obviously doing something to target those guns towards people who haven't, are likely to use them in crime. If it was a uniform thing and it just depended on how many guns you sold as to how many were traced back to your store, then that would be one thing. But it isn't that way. If we could close 1 or 2% of the bad apple gun dealers, but the only way we know that, at one time we used to know who they were in Virginia. We knew the top 10 sellers of guns who had the highest rate of guns being found at crime scenes. We knew who they were. One of them was right across the street from the Virginia State Police headquarters. But since this Tiahrt Amendment, their hands are tied. Even police forces can get information from the ATF, but they can only get it per gun. So they have to give a serial number to the ATF, and the ATF will say something about that gun. But they can't get aggregate data, which says that Joe's gun store sold 9,000 guns last year, and of which 200 came back from crime scenes within 5 years, or within the year. We can't get that information. They cannot aggregate that information. They can't even do it basically without the name of the store.
Well, I think for our next show next week, I'm going to come back with a little research and see if the House has addressed that in the various bills that they've passed in the last couple of years, or if it's on the agenda for this year, unless what their intentions
there's
are.
been a number of attempts to get rid of the Tiahrt Amendment, but it hasn't, it's still there today.
Yeah.
One of the bad things about the NRA is that they have successfully lobbied to have the ATF, which is the very important ATF organization to monitor gun trade, to have them hamstrung. They're not allowed to computerize information. They're not even allowed to keep up with the workload with the number of employees that they're allowed to have. There's been at every step, it's been made almost impossible for them to do their job. They still are required to check every gun dealers on a regular basis, but because they don't have the money or the manpower, they don't check a gun dealer perhaps more than once every 12 years. And if you wait 12 years to check whether a gun dealer is one of the bad apple gun dealers, and then you have to go through and find them being in violation for a number of times, so you could go back in another 12 years and find out, yep, you're still doing that bad thing, then we'll start the process of trying to close you down. And by the way, if we try and close you down, all you have to do is change the name of the owner of the business, and you can keep your inventory. If we do success and continue selling it, so you transfer the gun store to your wife and you continue everything as you were doing until they catch you 12 years down the road again. The other thing is, if we do manage to close you down, you can still keep all your inventory, except now you can sell it without a background check because you're no longer a gun dealer. So
that's quite a story. And we're in a difficult time. We want to pass laws on the federal level. We have a new administration. We have a titular majority in the Senate, but we still have to deal with the filibuster. And we mentioned that last week as well. The filibuster still requires Democrats to come up with 10 Republicans in the Senate to pass any bill that's not unrelated to the budget, which we all know there's talk of the budget reconciliation process, and economic related bills can go through that, but bills that relate to issues like this and historically have not gone through that process, have not been allowed. And so unless they change that process or find some way to win over 10 Republicans, which as we know, can be very difficult in this partisan environment, we could see again for the next 2 years important legislation related to gun safety stymied at the federal level, which will be extremely frustrating after, especially when the public perceives that one political party has won majority, has control of Washington, and still can't achieve things that they want for their own safety. And it's going to be a difficult endeavor.
This is one of the unintended consequences of having a constitution which is so concerned about tyranny that they divided the powers in such a way that really it makes it very, very difficult for even a majority to get their way.
Well, I have to say that the filibuster is, in my humble opinion and others, unconstitutional. It's never been endorsed by the Supreme Court. It is completely a rule of the Senate. It relies upon a phrase in the Constitution that says the two bodies, the Senate and the House, can devise their own rules to operate. But that is a very far cry from suggesting that they can create a rule that undercuts the very premise of majority rule in our country, as well as in both legislatures, where in the Constitution they spell out situations where a non-majority situation is necessary to achieve something. For instance, impeachment requires 2/3 vote. That's spelled out. When it's not spelled out, there's an accepted view that everything else is by majority. And yet we have managed to allow this to go on, and the Supreme Court has been unwilling to step in and rule on this. They have found every possible reason to avoid ruling on this. The most recent time was a couple of years ago, I believe, when they found that the parties bringing the matter didn't have standing, didn't have the right to bring it. But we do need to change that. Maybe we'll have to go through another case.
You don't even have to stand there and talk for 16 hours now and forego going to the bathroom for 16 hours. You just actually say the word that you're going to do it, and now it's become just something that a flag that you have to wave, and that's it.
Well, that's one possible change that we could make. I know Norm Ornstein, who's an expert on Washington and has written a great deal, has argued for a change in the way the filibuster is operated so that it can be more difficult to hold up legislation. And I don't know if, there are two particular United States senators, Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, a Democrat, and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, a Democrat, who have expressed opposition to eliminating the filibuster and to some degree changing it, although it's not clear if they're completely opposed to the kind of change that Norm Ornstein has recommended. But we're going to need to find a way to get around it or change it if we're going to move forward. So we have a few minutes left. Let's go back for a moment and talk about any bills that you think we should really be taking a close look at as a crossover, that we have to watch, that we may oppose, that we may want to change, and that people should maybe contact our legislators to express concern about it. Give us a few of those.
Like I say, I really, other than some technicalities, I don't think we need to oppose anything much. There's, like I said, technicalities, and we'll try and deal with those by going through the system. But the thing that people need to be talking about is trying to get, especially senators, because most of the bills that we support are House bills. They outnumber the Senate bills that we support, and they'll be going over to the Senate. And to be honest with you, they'll all go over to Senate Judiciary. And within the Senate Judiciary, we have a number of people who need to be shored up a little bit, such as Senator Deeds, Senator Edwards on some issues, Senator Chap Peterson, and those people need to be told that these are good bills. In some cases, there's a Senate bill which has passed, in which case we're probably okay with the House version going to them. Because if they pass the Senate one, you would think that they would pass the House version as long as it's conformed. But there are a couple of things that are going to go across there which they have not seen, and Chap's very likely to stick his nose in and try and reorganize one of the bills to his liking, which is usually not to everybody else's liking.
Do you have any inkling of any of the bills that you think might face some difficulty in the Senate?
Well, we understand right now, even though one of the bills the Senate bill is passed for the misdemeanor family assault prohibition, the House version is struggling, and it was supposed to be voted on this morning. It may well have been voted on while we were talking. but I see that the Senate is still out. And the Senate, we have two good bills coming through there. One of them being the criminal history record check for rental firearms, which is a method of trying to limit suicides, and 1382, House Bill 1382, which is the 1382, which is Barbara Favola's domestic violence prohibition, misdemeanor domestic family violence. And we understand that that one's struggling a little. And if it gets out, it will be a narrow vote. And we'll just have to see. Obviously, if it fails in the House, then the Senate version that goes over is also likely to fail. And that would be the biggest disaster, I think.
Generally, at this point, if something passes the Senate, it's pretty much a done deal, right? The House will support what the Senate passes?
No, not at all. No, there's no done deals here. Even deals that are done are not done. They can be undone again. Bills that have died have been mysteriously resurrected overnight, and bills that have been heard and passed by indefinitely in a committee have actually been taken directly to, or in a subcommittee, have been taken directly to the committee and passed. So there's all kinds of shenanigans. You can't really expect that things will be dealt with the same way. In fact, there's some animosity between the two houses, and sometimes they're trying to prove that they're a little smarter than the other. And the Senate's always trying to prove that they're smarter than the House, and vice versa. So,
but there do seem to be a few. We've got a few people you've mentioned in the Senate who are particularly have a history of being
ornery.
Yes, maybe less progressive on these bills than we'd like to see.
Yeah.
Do you see that anyone in the House who fits that category as well?
Not really. The House is very much is very much divided. Like I said, when I first started this, we would often get Republicans voting on good bills. We would often get Democrats voting on bad bills, and it was a mixture. There were some strong people, strong Dems at the top on gun violence prevention, some very bad Republicans at the bottom who never voted with us ever, and then in the middle was a mixture. But over the years, that has separated out, and now it's pretty much the Republicans will vote lockstep against something, and the Democrats not quite so lockstep. They one or two Democrats will swing, but it's very rare to get a Republican to swing over anymore because they're afraid of being primaried from the right.
Well, and next time we meet, we're going to talk more about the success of bills that were being considered today, which we didn't get results on.
I had hoped to be able to give you this morning the situation at crossover, because earlier in the week they had talked about getting second reading bills and taking them fully through to the third reading when they heard the second reading and get them out of the way so that there would be a final vote on the floor before we got to crossover. Well, they're taking it down to the last minute now, and I've still got a list here of 5 bills that need to be floor voted today, and the Senate is still in recess. They went into recess shortly after they opened at 10 o'clock this morning, and they're still in recess now, which is, there's obviously something which they're very exercised about, that they're going to come back out, and it takes a long while for them to, reach a consensus.
Okay, well, we will address it next week then. As well, we can talk a bit about the role the governor plays in legislation and how he can be involved in fixing or changing legislation even after it's been passed.
That's the last resort, governor's rewrite or governor's amendments. Yes.
Yeah, we'll get into details about that. We'll have to get into details about that next week. And let me just say before we go that we have to be thrilled that the House yesterday passed legislation to repeal the
death penalty.
Death penalty. Yes, we've seen changes in the death penalty. We're going to be seeing our state become a state that bans the death penalty, which is exciting. As well, though, just really on a separate subject, I want to tip my cap to the fact that we're going to see the first ever repeal of a constitutional amendment, one that
Oh, yes.
yes,
Yeah.
one that banned marriage equality in the state. And with kudos to Mark Sickles and Mark Levine for the House measure that passed. We want to send that out because this is really historic in Virginia history to repeal an amendment to the Constitution, and certainly one that we all were eager to see repealed. We really don't know what the Supreme Court may do on this law. We have a much more conservative court now, so it's really really critical that we've made this move, and I'm thrilled that we're in the process of repealing it.
Yeah, there's some good stuff not GVP related that's going through, and it's this year, because of the low number of bills, 28 to follow, I've been able to look into a lot more subjects that are near and dear to my heart, but that didn't have time for when you've got 140 bills to shepherd.
Well, one benefit of a slower session is our chance to talk. Once again, Andy Goddard, Legislative Director of the Virginia Center for Public Safety. Thank you. If you want to reach out to Andy, you can contact me, Paul Friedman, at paulfriedman@safercountry.org. You can find these conversations at safercountry.org/media. And I hope you will. If you've watched this one on recording, I hope you'll watch the others. You'll find them, I think, interesting. And we look forward to getting together again next week. Check out our Facebook page, Safer Country. Also, we're on Instagram and Twitter, so you can learn more about us in those respects as well. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, everyone. And thank you again, Andy, for joining us.
Thank you. I'm off to Greenbrier.
Enjoy your anniversary party.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.